Wonderful. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our July iteration of Conversations on Social Reproduction. I'm Prabha Kotishwaran. I'm a professor of law at King's College London, and welcome to all of you. I'm really excited today to celebrate the work of two wonderful authors, Elena Shih and Lyndsey Beutin, who authored these two fantastic books that I'm really delighted to share with you today. So our first speaker will be Lyndsey Beutin, who has written Trafficking in Anti-Blackness, Modern Day Slavery, White Indemnity, and Racial Justice. It has been published by Duke University Press in 2023. And the second book is called Manufacturing Freedom, Sex Work, Anti-Trafficking, Rehab, and the Racial Wages of Rescue by Elena Shih. Now, Lyndsey is Assistant Professor of Communication Studies and Media Arts at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada. And Elena is Manning Assistant Professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies at Brown University. So I'm really delighted to welcome both of them and to hear about their really important work, because for those of us who have been in the anti-trafficking space and have had a prior life studying issues of labor around sex work and trafficking, we had kind of thought that many of the critical moves had been made, and despite that, the anti-trafficking industrial complex seems to be getting bigger and more influential. But I have to say, having read almost entirely both books, that they really inaugurate a new chapter in the critique of the anti-trafficking industrial complex. And it's interesting because I think we are 20 years now since the adoption of the Palermo Protocol on trafficking. So I think the kind of fine-grained empirical ethnographic work as well as conceptual work that these two books present, provide a really robust and a very important critique of anti-trafficking discourse, law, and policy. So I will now hand over to Lyndsey, who will go first, followed by Elena. They will both speak for about 15 minutes each on their respective books, and will then offer some comments on each other's work. And obviously, if you keep, noting your questions and comments in the chat, but there will be enough time for Q&A at the end. So over to you, Lyndsey. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm so excited to hear your comments and thoughts on our work. Thank you to Prabha for inviting us, and to Amy and Barbara for organizing us, and to Elena for your incredible work. Okay. Okay, so today I'm going, and I'll just say I can't see you all, so if ever you can't see my slides or something's happening, please interrupt me verbally. Okay. So today I'm going to share with you some of the broad contours of my book entitled Trafficking in Anti-Blackness, Modern Day Slavery, White Indemnity, and Racial Justice. So the book offers an analysis of how campaigns that aim to end human trafficking use the phrase modern day slavery to draw attention to their cause in problematic ways that end up reinforcing anti-Black racism, structural anti-Blackness, and what I call white transcendence. So it's a rhetorical analysis of the term modern day slavery and how it's used in the visual culture of anti-trafficking campaigns. So I walk through how examples of anti-trafficking discourse invoke the history, memory, and aesthetics of transatlantic slavery and abolition to support political agendas that uphold border control, criminalization, and the pathologizing of Black families. By focusing on how unhelpful solutions are justified by invoking the history and memory of slavery, I show that the anti-trafficking apparatus uses modern-day slavery rhetoric and imagery to circumvent Western historical responsibility for transatlantic slavery and to undermine broader campaigns for racial justice. One of my goals in the book is to get scholars to move beyond delineating what anti-trafficking organizations get wrong in order to better understand the scope of what they produce. So instead of asking, how could organizations make better interventions? How could they have more holistic responses? What would a more accurate representation be? Instead of debating, is it or isn't it slavery? What would be a better metaphor or term? I'm trying to draw attention to the question, what does using the term slavery do? What does it do materially and symbolically, and for who? So in the book, I argue that invoking the specific language of slavery and reproducing Enlightenment narratives that justify the transatlantic slave trade, narratives like slavery in Africa and Black incapacity for self-governance, the anti-trafficking apparatus produces white indemnity, which is a rhetorical insurance policy for former slaving nations and their racial beneficiaries against being held liable for the dispossessions of transatlantic slavery and European colonialism. Okay, so I know most of us are critical anti-trafficking folks, but before continuing, I always pause and clarify that I'm writing critically about campaigns to end human trafficking. So what I'm saying is that anti-trafficking campaigns do a lot of harm to the people anti-trafficking advocates purport to be helping. And of course, this is often confusing because ending human trafficking sounds like a good thing, or at least a well-intentioned idea. Unfortunately, however, multilateral anti-trafficking policy was not and was never designed to help people. It was architected to protect states. So the current anti-trafficking apparatus, as many of you know and write about, comes to be in the late 1990s and the early 2000s in response to states' desire to increase control over their borders. Anti-trafficking's border patrol and policing agenda is not a secret. Critical feminist scholars of trafficking have long shown that moral panics about women's mobility, sexuality, and agency have been used to legitimize regressive immigration policies. So the takeaway here for me and for this project is that anti-trafficking policy exists because it aligns with state imperatives for control, not to challenge them. So despite claiming to be modern day abolitionists, like the 19th century abolitionists, the larger anti-trafficking apparatus does not support Black freedom of movement. So when I say the anti-trafficking apparatus, I'm referring to the constellation of governments, global philanthropists, the UN, the US State Department, community-based organizations, transnational NGOs, concerned citizens, churches, corporations, media representations, news organizations, and domestic and international policies that design awareness campaigns, regulations, and interventions to end human trafficking. And when I say anti-trafficking discourse, I'm referring to discourse as a system of representation that produces knowledge. So analyzing that system of representation is important to understand what truth claims it relies on, reproduces, and naturalizes. So in the case of anti-trafficking discourse, some of those truth claims that it naturalizes are that Black people on the continent of Africa and across the diaspora were and are the enslavers of the past and present, that they were the original enslavers of their own people, and that they continue to enslave one another well after North Americans and Europeans have ended the practice. So this rhetorical move upholds the myth of white benevolence, yes, of course, but it also suggests that Black people have no one to blame but themselves for racial inequality and the legacies of slavery. Doing so, I argue, renders Black people, instead of white Americans and Europeans, as the enslavers of the past and the present, leaving former slaving nations not sufficiently liable for redress, i.e. reparations for slavery. So in the book, I show how the blame-free European and North American subject and state is constructed and upheld via 3 avenues. The first, shifting blame to contemporary Black mothers in Africa and the Caribbean. The second, multiculturalizing slavery beyond a Black subject. And the third, using data, technology, and empiricism to make all of this racist nonsense seem neutral and objective. So for the sake of time today, I'll have to skip the data one, but you can read about it in the book, or we can talk about it in the Q&A. All right, so let me show you what I mean. Within anti-trafficking discourse, Black mothers in Haiti are said to sell their children into slavery through the Restovic system, which is not slavery, but a process of child fosterage arranged through family and social networks. Anti-trafficking advocates intervene on what they call slavery by offering parenting classes that are supposed to educate Haitian mothers about the importance of so-called child freedom, and with family planning education that has historically been based in population control imperatives geared toward averting Black births. In so doing, Haitian mothers, the descendants of enslaved people who fought for and won their children's freedom during the Haitian Revolution, are represented as being incapable of imagining freedom, of needing to be taught what freedom could look like for Haitian children. So following Michel Rothtriot, the contention that enslaved Africans and their descendants could not envision freedom is a result of the racial ontologies that hierarchically organize the world. By representing Haitian mothers as today's enslavers, Haiti's revolutionary past as the ultimate site of Black self-emancipation from slavery through successful slave revolts beginning in 1791 is rendered as proof that Black freedom leads to chaos, another narrative. Black mothers are deemed the primary cause and thus ultimately to blame for Black children's unequal life chances. If US plantation slavery was once argued to have a, quote, civilizing influence on Black people, now US-based NGOs and their local partners abroad aim to civilize poor Black mothers by teaching them about children's human rights. In both cases, white people are represented as predisposed to care for slaves, and Black unfreedom is represented as the result of Black pathology. These are both alibis of white inculpability. NGOs and the State Department also use the same discursive framing within Ghana by specifically blaming, quote, modern day slavery on Black mothers living in Ghana and Haiti, 2 of the most important historic sites of Black freedom. The histories of transatlantic slavery and 19th and 20th century Black political revolution are invoked and resignified as purported evidence of what Black freedom results in. The Black family's inevitable slip back to the pre-modern state of self-enslavement in the absence of white involvement. So on the Ghana example, a news article in The Guardian from 2016 about child labor in Ghanaian fishing villages reads, quote, "My kids hate me, I sold them." The quote is taken from a Ghanaian mother whose story was featured in the photo essay. The article ran as the main feature on the landing page of The Guardian's Modern Day Slavery in Focus news platform about human trafficking, which is sponsored by the Anti-Trafficking Foundation, Humanity United. The article, its images, and its facts were created by You Belong, a volunteerism organization that provides international volunteer opportunities for groups from the global north to go to the global south. Critical and anti-trafficking scholar Sam Ochiere and Ghanaian politician Betty Mensah have critiqued news stories of child fishing slaves because they, quote, reflect a limited understanding of the lived realities and are, quote, mostly made by Western-based or funded journalists and NGOs with the help of local affiliates. There's a lot to say about the Guardian article, and if you've recently seen the BBC expose about IJM that features Ochiere's research, you have a sense of the critiques. But I mentioned the article here because it's notable for how seamlessly the language of slavery adheres to the rhetorical figure of the bad Black mother. It raises the question, What makes it so easy to accept that Ghanaian mothers would sell their children? In the book, I recount the rhetorical history of blaming Black women and show how it has done a tremendous amount of political work to support governance imperatives of states that are structured by white supremacy. Blaming Black mothers for enslaving their kids in anti-trafficking discourse operates as a stunning rhetorical reversal that obscures the actually existing history of slavery. It was, after all, not Black women who enslaved their kids, but the 17th century white British colonial law that made children born to Black enslaved mothers legally enslaved. Black women's manual labor and reproductive labor and laboring, in Jennifer Morgan's terms, fueled the white accumulation of wealth by dispossessing enslaved Black people of labor, autonomy, wages, and kin. It allowed white slave owners and their heirs to produce and inherit future laborers for free, despite anti-trafficking's present-day claims that slaves are, quote, cheaper today than in the 19th century. Such a system preserved white property interests, it racialized social control, and it secured the social hierarchy of race in the New World. Across advocacy and news representations of fishing in Ghana, slavery within Africa is either represented as a timeless problem of cultural backwardness or as a brand new problem that begins under Black rule. In either temporality, white enslavers are free of blame, European colonists are free of blame, and privileged global capitalists who continue to exploit everything become the rescuers who escape scrutiny altogether. So choosing to demonize Black mothers in highly symbolic places of Black freedom manifests, once again, a white common sense about Black freedom. Today's modern day slaves have no one to blame but their Black mothers. Okay, so by now you might be thinking, okay, I see what you mean about representations in Africa and the Caribbean, but what about modern day slavery in other places, like India? How does that relate to anti-Blackness? Great question. Within anti-trafficking discourse, when anti-trafficking discourse constructs contemporary Indians as slaves, exploitation of Indian workers is simultaneously framed as a problem of cultural pathology or of Indians not knowing freedom exists, but with a twist. An anti-trafficking campaign proclaims, quote, how do you reach people enslaved in India to inform them that freedom is possible? Call them. Such a proposition that the phone call could free someone from slavery suggests that the reason people are exploited is because they don't know better. The narrative tells us that a technological fix, the cell phone call, will end lingering backward practices that relegate even cell phone connected India to not quite fully modern status. The figure of the Indian slave, though, also creates a multicultural victim of slavery that suggests slavery is no longer racial, by which anti-trafficking advocates mean not only Black. In so doing, slavery is represented as a victimhood category that is not the exclusive property of the Black diaspora. Black people, in other words, are not exceptionally deserving of redress or reparations for slavery. The anti-trafficking cell phone is the liberator in India, where it frees rural Indian women from their culture and welcomes them into the global free market economy, which absolves former colonial powers of wrongdoing while obscuring asymmetries of global. Oh. Hi, are we good? Okay. But when anti-trafficking discourse conjures the cell phone in Africa, its magical freedom-granting properties are presented as squandered by Black corruption. In anti-trafficking discourse, slavery exists in the Democratic Republic of Congo because corrupt Congolese businessmen, militias, and judges exploit and enslave young children and adults who work in unregulated mines, not overseen by US and UK corporate responsibility regimes and supply chain monitoring. So in such a reversal, it's not the plunder of mineral riches by multinational corporations, nor the histories of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade that have created such structures of economic domination. It's not those structures that exploit workers in either India or the DRC. Rather, it's represented as clean technology that frees Indian slaves with quick techno-utopian fixes, and it's dirty corruption that makes slavery in Africa an intractable feature of Black pathology. So you see how these two racial figures work together to uphold white supremacy. Okay, so to wrap up and bring it all together, by reading the anti-trafficking image economy through a memory of slavery framework, new insights appear. Anti-trafficking discourse reproduces the logics and narratives of Enlightenment thought that assert a global hierarchy of race anchored in Black unfitness for freedom. Anti-trafficking discourse re-signifies sites and histories of Black freedom as evidence of Black inability to self-govern. Anti-trafficking multiculturalizes slavery in the past and in the present as evidence that no single nation, especially the US, is exceptionally to blame for slavery, and that no single group, especially the Black diaspora, is exceptionally entitled to redress. Anti-trafficking uses the discourse and aesthetics of data to make all of these claims seem rational and objective. And yet, anti-trafficking remains popular with a wide and broadly diverse range of publics and is increasingly entrenched and legitimized in policy, higher ed, social work and medical school training, and research grants for social scientists. Why? I argue that anti-trafficking is politically useful for former slaving nations and their racial beneficiaries because it refashions the historic justifications for white supremacy into today's abolition. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lyndsey. That was really, really powerful. So over to you, Elena.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. It's really special to be able to reconnect with so many people that we know in the audience, who we've been collaborating with for so long, and particularly wonderful to celebrate and share with Lyndsey, who I think, for public disclosure, Lyndsey and I probably talk every day. And for those of you who might be graduate students, it's it's so important to find your late night texting buddy when you're working on hard work because that late night texting buddy ends up in actual sentences in your book. And so it's incredible to be able to share this moment with Lyndsey and you all, while also I'm always astounded by, despite talking to her every day, how I always learn something new from her every time she speaks. I don't know how that continues to be possible, but here we go. Okay, do you see my slides? Okay, thank you. Also interrupt me because I can't see both at the same time. I have a new introduction for this book. So this is the new part. The rest is kind of maybe old stuff that you have already seen me present. But this is a new thing that I wanted to share. In 2017, I happened to be passing through New York City while the NOMI Network was hosting its annual gala. And for those of you who don't know, this is an American NGO that claims to work with human trafficking survivors, quote unquote, in Cambodia and India. And NOMI's particular claim to fame is it's by her body, not her bag, tote bag, seen here for sale, for $30 US, and first celebrated by a Huffington Post blog piece in 2014 that I also posted here. But at this particular gala, their 10th anniversary, individual tickets had jumped to $500 a piece. And because I couldn't afford that, I asked if I could volunteer. I arrived to a beautifully set, lavish dinner at New York's Chelsea Piers Lighthouse. And I watched that night as the majority of tables in the room were bought out by corporate sponsors like JP Morgan and people like that. But they instantly in one night were able to exceed their fundraising goal of $300,000 in a single event. This is an organization that by 2021 had an annual revenue of just over $3.6 million. And so one question continues to emerge for me throughout my fieldwork as I was caught by the seemingly stunning opulence of American fundraisers for anti-trafficking that profited off of the portrayals of victims of trafficking living in abject poverty. And so the book is interested in these new ethical markets in so-called slave-free goods, but also new adjacent categories of new things being established. So we hear freedom business is an entire new enterprise. You see business schools beginning to talk about human trafficking business, but the business, the freedom in freedom business, the social in social enterprise, and the ethical in ethical consumption seems to perpetually remove any consideration of power, certainly of inequality, of these working relationships between producers and consumers. And this is a startling erasure that we see that anti-trafficking is able to do as well. As Lyndsey said, you put anti-trafficking, you put human trafficking in front of something, and it's even seemingly absolves you of any kind of critique. So besides profit, I was really interested in what are all the ways that low-wage women's work and third world women's choices become completely subsumed and erased in the global rat race to end human trafficking. And to answer some of those questions, my research began working alongside the so-called rehabilitated victims of human trafficking in China and Thailand. Each Tuesday and Friday night on Cowboy Street, which is one of Bangkok's largest and well-known red light districts, a group of American missionaries embark on what they call human trafficking outreach ministry and ask the Holy Spirit's guidance in identifying broken women who might need their assistance. These American Christian women activists patronize go-go bars where Thai women who are adorned in everything from bondage gear to frilly lingerie and who are identified primarily by numbers taped to different parts of their bodies dance on a maze of platforms. One of the first people that I met in my research was a sex worker named Pawn. I watched as outreach workers purchased Pawn one non-alcoholic drink in order to quote unquote buy her time. And they let her know about an alternative employment opportunity making jewelry. They shared that if she was interested in leaving her job at the bar, she could submit an application to work at Cowboy Rescue, which is a socially entrepreneurial business that sells and markets jewelry made by quote unquote survivors of human trafficking. Once Pawn's employment application was accepted, she was ceremoniously handed a uniform, which she would be required to wear to work each day of the week. And this was a black polo shirt with the NGOs emblem embroidered on the chest and the Thai word for freedom stitched across the white. And in nearby Beijing, I found a similar project that since 2015 has recruited Chinese sex workers to become jewelry makers. Like Pawn, a 26-year-old Chinese worker named Luo Yan now earns a minimum wage according to local Chinese standards, which happens to be a third to a fifth of what she formerly earned as a sex worker. Most importantly, Luo Yan and Pawn and most of their co-workers do not consider themselves to be victims of trafficking. They self-identify as migrant workers and sex workers, as mothers, daughters, sisters. But these projects brand them with the human trafficking label because they consider all sex work to be inherently exploitative and thus indistinguishable from human trafficking. Additionally, they know that the human trafficking label will be extremely profitable for them. So both jewelry from both projects is sold 7,000 miles away through the bustling anti-trafficking movement in the United States. These two organizations are just part of a growing number of dozens of anti-trafficking projects that have turned to the market in order to raise funds and awareness around the issue of trafficking. Organizations working from Thailand to Nepal to Peru, Moldova, Uganda, and even in the United States itself now focus on selling the wares made by victims of trafficking, again, what they called slave-free goods. And here is where I would ask you to think back to Lyndsey's work on what the work that itself is doing to call these products slave-free goods, but includes everything from jewelry to tea to tote bags, cashmere scarves, and silk pajamas, all sold under a variety of sexy, media-savvy forms of branding slogans, asking people to quote unquote, buy for freedom, purchase for purpose in things like, as you see here, the Freedom Store. Competition for these funds is fierce and has created a veritable market in funding in what Laura Augustine has earlier termed the human trafficking rescue industry. Elizabeth Bernstein has labeled redemptive capitalism. The late sex worker activist Carol Lee has called the anti-trafficking industrial complex, and that Janie Chuang has conceptualized as philanthrocapitalism. In Bangkok, workers begin their day by huddling around a time punch clock, and you see some of those punch cards there, eager to clock in by 9 a.m. and hurry over to the nearby church to begin the day with Christian worship. And a single sheet of paper sits in the back of the worship hall where workers are instructed to sign in if they arrive late. And latecomers are to log their names and indicate the times that they arrived at church to the minute, as each worker is penalized 2 baht or 10-cent US dollar for each minute she is late. After making jewelry for the remaining 7 hours of the day with an hour break for lunch, the workday ends at 5 p.m., where workers clock out and disperse across the vast Bangkok metropolis. Some share rooms in high-rent apartments nearby in central Bangkok, while others travel as far as 2 hours away to find affordable housing. Rather than returning home, other workers like Go, age 35 and a worker for 4 years, commute to part-time jobs in the service sector. Go is a restaurant worker, in order to earn additional income because their salaries as jewelry makers do not sufficiently cover a living expense. And so salaries at both organizations is just at the local minimum wage, although workers do receive medical insurance, weekends, and Christian holidays off. Go and Pawn, at the woman described at the beginning of this talk, are part of a staff of over 100 Thai workers who have left jobs as sex workers to become jewelry makers. Pawn described to me how when she first joined, she was startled that she was required to sign a contract agreeing that she would no longer sell sex, nor would she patronize any of the bars where she used to work. And more recently, this behavioral contract has been required by mandatorily demanding that workers submit their Facebook passwords so that organizations could monitor the sexual activity of their workers online. And of course, workers created multiple Facebook accounts because they too have, savvily incredible ways of resisting the different forms of surveillance and patrol. And I think this was one of the most challenging parts of writing this book, was hoping to capture these brilliant moments of like power and outright defiance that I saw on a day-to-day basis on the shop floor. But each time I wrote them, I realized that in revealing these strategies, these workplace strategies that workers had acquired, that they would make them visible to employees. And as I write about in a particular instance of the book, different trespasses of all the different rules that the organization has, which has also included things like your skirt has to be, at least 2 finger digits below, or it cannot be 2 finger digits higher than your knee, which happen to be the same requirements that the bars used to use. So there's a lot of interesting workplace similarities between formal work and sex work and work as jewelry makers. But in revealing resistance, it offered new ways for employers to co-opt that resistance. And so many of those really, really powerful moments don't make it into the book. I think one really important thing that's important to know is that so many workers do need to continue doing sex work, do choose to continue doing sex work because minimum wage jobs cannot sustain a living for them. But this requirement that workers no longer see friends or visit environments in which sex is being sold, even if they are no longer selling it, is intended to prevent the workers from, as one activist said, recidivism back into the sex industry. So speaking of sex and sex work as addictions, activists pathologize sex work as a disease that must be conquered via rehabilitative labor, but also appropriate Western femininity. So I've learned so much from Lyndsey in the Blame Black Mothers chapter, because in so many of these shelter or workplace arrangements, you hear this really infantilizing language around referring to full-grown women as girls. And what that does is that constitutes their now employers, these Western activists, as their mothers. And in the Chinese case in particular, where they are not allowed to live in their own housing, but they have to live mandatorily in the shelter, the people who govern the shelter are called house moms. And so there's this desire to repair trafficking, not just through wage labor, but also reconstituting appropriate Western family. But as a tool of both instruction and correction, jewelry then becomes the perfect antidote for quote unquote lost women. And this is a broad label that's used to include sex workers, the homeless, drug and alcohol users, because as one activist noted, quote, the act of making beautiful jewelry restores femininity to where femininity has been lost. These rescue organizations inextricably weave their rehabilitation narratives with that of monolithic sexual victimization, which never lets their employees define for themselves their former jobs as sex workers and whether they were voluntary or not. Selling what is called slave-free jewelry as part of my research at secular anti-trafficking fairs in the United States, I was really interested as volunteers were boastful to consumer audiences about the transformative effects of jewelry making. In particular, I remember one particular fair where activists were eager to share that, quote, our girls are not required to participate in Bible study. And hearing this, the secular audience that had gathered it happened to be at a church, happily opened their pocketbooks to quote unquote buy for freedom. But what activists failed to mention is that workers are required to make jewelry throughout the hour if they choose to skip Bible study. Thus, all Chinese workers attend Bible study for the break in manual labor that it provides, though none of the women in Beijing has converted. And so this convenient and strategic obfuscation of religious objectives amongst secular consumers allows evangelical Christian organizations to be indistinguishable from the hundreds of anti-trafficking organizations that frequent anti-trafficking conferences, fairs, and symposia across the US. So drawing on a host of symptoms related to the vulnerability of Asian women, loosely including everything from gender discrimination, poverty to unequal education, American organizations equate third world poverty with human trafficking and a pervasive skepticism that a third world women's choices can be dignified if they are made within constraints. These narratives garner immense sympathy and financial support and profit for NGOs, but they do little to raise worker salaries beyond the minimum wage. Ultimately, vocational training centers succeed not because they provide the alternatives they presume, but because they create a transnational moral economy of low-wage women's work in which activists sell jewelry as a proxy commodity for fair trade, dignified labor, and ethical consumption. Within such rescue programs, manual labor is embedded within the tactics of moral reform, collapsing transnational panics around sexuality and gender-based rights. These labor processes of reform work are largely contested by workers within these programs, but are completely invisible in sites of movement organization throughout the global north, where consumer activists optimistically champion the goals of transnational mobilization through the market. So much of this work is rooted in sex worker activism, and it's also rooted in worker organizing within the region. And I think that one of the main takeaways from so many reform jewelry makers who are working in these programs is just a question that they have. They don't understand why for years they worked in what they call truly exploitative industries as domestic workers for H&M factories, in restaurants, but it is only through their sex work that they deserved to be rescued. And so they constantly point to the unequal conditions that exist in global factory work. And I think that what's particularly telling is that rarely do anti-trafficking interventions that seem to reform on this kind of like decent work level, rarely have they ever considered interventions into worker organizing in these places. And I love that Lyndsey brought up these new forays into global supply chain transparency that have brought now billions of dollars to new corporate CSR and responsible sourcing divisions for large corporations that have now all been mandated to script modern day slavery statements into their mission and statements. And so all of this has once again accumulated so much money and power at the level of corporations to like emphasize transparency, to begin to try to look at transparency along their supply chain. Never has any of that money been given to, say, promote worker organizing or train workers on how to organize themselves. The final chapters of the book, where I sort of telescope out from the ethnographic work with jewelry making, really looks to lessons that sex worker and migrant worker rights organizations have pointed us to. I draw very, very heavily on lessons gleaned from APNSW's Bad Rehab music video that I recommend everybody to see. It in particular launches a strong criticism of the Somali mom scandal in Cambodia, which we don't have time to talk about. And then, of course, an organization that, you know, I was based in Thailand, but every weekend I would take a 12-hour train and escape to Chiang Mai to the Can-Do Bar, which is, I think, one of the first or only sex worker-owned cooperative bars. They rescued me. This is like a beautiful formation that they offered to me. They rescued me by like filling my life with the most incredible kinds of resistance. And this is just one of their, like all of their political art pieces are extremely accessible, bilingual, trilingual. This is another video I encourage everybody to watch, The Last Rescue in Siam, which details like a typical Thai raid that happens, but of course triumphantly ends in the sex worker, as you see here. She's put into rehab to learn how to sew. And while she's in rehab, she sews herself a ladder to escape. So on that end, I think I would say, if I had started this project as like a college student or high school student, start trying to answer this question around like the voice of the voiceless, it really ends with this provocation that those voices are always there, but how do we point to those like systemic forms of power that occlude them from being able to be seen? Thank you.
Wow, that is amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Elena. It really speaks to the power of ethnography as a way to sort of bear witness to, quite a cruel system of rehabilitation. So thank you both for your presentations. I think we now have an opportunity to watch them in conversation with each other. So Elena and Lyndsey will sort of comment on each other's presentations, and then we will ask them some questions. Thanks. Go ahead.
Thank you. Elena, I think you have to end your slides unless you want to. Okay, yeah. Okay, so now everyone gets to be in on the fun of me and Elena's nightly chats that we'll now do publicly with y'all. But first I'll offer some thoughts on Elena's book and just how important it is. One thing is that books like mine, like discourse analysis, rhetorical analysis, could not exist without research like Elena's. So I think that one thing that characterizes our late night chats is me talking about, you know, how I'm analyzing a representation and then texting Elena, I'm right? Like, that's really not what's going on, right? Like the NGO is saying this, but that's not really what the workers are experiencing, right? So that kind of constant interplay of of research that kind of looks at anti-trafficking interventions and media materials at two different stages is, I think, one of the things that makes our friendship so productive for our research, but also reading the books together, I think, really powerful. So that's always the first thing I start with, that my work couldn't exist without Elena's work, and the ethnography of being with workers and hearing workers' experiences and really bringing those to light. So I think the real strength of the book is the way Elena peels back the layers on anti-trafficking's marketing materials and representations and shows us what's underneath them, including these more nuanced things around the example you gave, Elena, around they say that Bible study isn't required, but it's technically true, but here's this whole other lens. So we get in Elena's book much more complicated stories of migration, identity negotiation, and workplace negotiations around all kind of low-wage jobs that are just much less marketable than the anti-trafficking narratives that these stories get turned into and then marketed as. And of course, one of the main through lines of Elena's work is always this drawing attention to the paradox of the commodification of workers' stories for major incentives, tons of fundraising that never goes back to the workers themselves. And I think shows that what anti-trafficking advocates are really in the business of is, number one, to continue with the evangelical, saving their own souls, and number two, to connect to my work, this kind of indemnification, right? This way of saying, like, we are the good ones, or we're not racist because, or we're not complicit in global exploitation, even though we are part of multinational corporations, because we're helping women in Asia. So I think the other strength of Elena's book is that within anti-trafficking discourse right now, there's a real emphasis on what they call survivor stories. And the survivor stories that we always get magically reflect the exact contours of the anti-trafficking discourse that has been kind of put out and then reformed through incorporating activist and scholar critiques over the past 25 years. So I think that what Elena's book shows us is, shows us how a lot of the survivors of anti-trafficking, the people who have lived through the anti-trafficking intervention and are on the other side of it, or have chosen to, continue to work within it because it provides some type of need in terms of health insurance or something that other low-wage jobs don't. What Elena's book shows us is that those voices are not the survivor voices that anti-trafficking is interested in lifting up. And I think this is where I really get the heart punch, because there are no more incisive critiques of the anti-trafficking industry than the stories that Elena presents here. So I want to highlight my three favorites to draw your attention to how rich both the ethnography, but the workers' analysis and voices are, which is always true, right? So anyone who's ever been a worker, which is all of us, we all know the conditions that we live and work within, and we all know the negotiations that we make, and the complex, decision making under constraints that people are always kind of negotiating, and that people who are facing the most structural oppressions are the most adept at negotiating by necessity, right? And the assumption that these people are somehow not able to is just such a long-standing colonial framework, truly. So the three critiques from the workers that we hear from in Elena's book. Number one, the opening vignette with Ploy, where she is sitting in a bar where she used to work and now is no longer allowed to work because no longer allowed to visit because she's a part of one of these anti-trafficking rehabilitation programs in Thailand. And Elena and Ploy are trying to celebrate Ploy's birthday, and Ploy is, scared, kind of, not scared, anxiously crouching in the corner, trying to make sure she's not going to be seen by these outreach workers. And she herself points to the logo on the shirt and says, "Does this look like freedom?" Crouching in the corner of a bar, right? So that story really shows us how anti-trafficking rehab and these initiatives regulate the daily lives of people that they say they're trying to free. And again, this is where Elena's work around moral economies and moral economies is really important, because it shows us that freedom does not mean self-determination, right? Freedom means some kind of something else. Freedom of your soul, I guess. I'm not sure. Okay, second one, the Nana, who is a worker in one of the Chinese rehabilitation programs. She's doing vocational training. She's doing her anti-trafficking rehab all week for 40 hours a week. And then on the weekends, she's learning how to become a baker. And she gets really a placement with a bagel shop in China. She gets fascinated by bagels and fascinated by the fact that so many expats would want bagels, which I was thinking about well, I'll save my own stories, but that was resonating with me. Like, when you just need a good bagel, you'd pay a lot for it. But what her critique shows is, like, despite really buying into the vocational training, doing the work, which is just an obscene amount of expectation, right? To spend your whole weekend doing these trainings while you're also doing the low-wage labor. And that vocational training is represented in anti-trafficking marketing materials as a structural solution, right? We're going, as Elena says in the book, don't give a man a fish, teach them how to fish, or something like that from the Bible. So the idea that vocational training is going to solve at the root the problems, Nana shows us no way, not true, because even with the training, even becoming a baker, even with loving presumably the way the story is told, really enjoying this baking experience and apprenticeship, ultimately cannot open her own bagel shop because she doesn't have the startup capital, right? Like, because of these geographies of asymmetrical economic arrangements that are not coincidental, right? That are not random, that have been created through these histories of colonial extraction. And then the third that I'll mention before turning it over is Jade. So Jade, we hear from throughout the book, and we get Jade again at one of the last chapters called Quitting Rehab, where Elena follows several people who have been rescued, who then rescue themselves from the rescuers, right? Who run away from the rescuers in a classical frame of that from Sunderland. And Jade's story shows us that even with learning how to make jewelry through these rehab things and becoming the most skilled jewelry maker in the rehab program, the kind of really good at design, really fast at making jewelry, ultimately decides to leave the rehabilitation program to start her own jewelry business, and once again cannot make a business out of the skills that she's developed because there is no market for the jewelry outside of the anti-trafficking apparatus's market. In other words, the thing that is being sold is the lived experience, or is the story of the experience of these women, right? Not the product. And Jade's story really drives that home and shows us, just in this kind of heartbreaking detail, like both the sincerity, like the critiques that workers have, but also the sincerity with which many of them participate in these programs and try to make it work. And then still, just what are we faced with at the end of the day? Global capitalism's refusal to allow entry into these markets in any kind of fair way. Okay, I think I'm over my 10 minutes, but I'll leave it there. Thank you, Elena, for this incredible work.
Thank you, Lyndsey. So Lyndsey's work has been incredibly healing in so many ways. And I think one very, very, very simple thing that I often think about is a pure matter of like vocabulary. I don't know if it's concept, but I love anti-trafficking apparatus. And I think that this is something that we need to all use. And the reason this is therapeutic for me is because as a PhD student in sociology, I had been funneled into this like political sociology track where I was a scholar of social movements, and I had to spend so much time proving to my advisors that anti-trafficking was in itself a social movement. So my whole book refers to like the anti-trafficking movement, and part of the work that I hope to bring was I hope to show all of the like the power laden within social movements. But it's so clear that the anti-trafficking apparatus as a phrase captures this so deftly. And I think that it's a move that we can all make in language that we use, but also captures this huge looming question of like, what is anti-trafficking? How do we encapsulate how powerful it really is? Equally, I think another vocabulary one for me that's easy and I carry with me every time I now like see things is anti-trafficking mediascape. And I think Lyndsey brings so much to this methodologically as a communication scholar and visual ethnographer. And it's another like really redefining category of the book to me. And significantly, I think what's so special about this book and when it does like mediascape analysis is that it draws on the obvious, the things that are visibly called anti-trafficking and quote unquote modern day slave experts. But most importantly, it brings those alongside actual work for Black freedom and liberation that are intentional, that those for movements themselves that might intentionally or not intentionally not call themselves anti-trafficking organizations. So you have to read this book fully to be taken on Lyndsey's journey and reading of everything from Libya to Haiti to Charlottesville to DC, through museum exhibits, films, newspaper articles, social media, and not just like an analysis of those themselves, but a layered analysis of public and NGO responses to all of those. My favorite chapter, one of my favorite chapters is chapter on blaming Black mothers that you shared a bit about, not just by how horrifying jubilant anti-trafficking organizations are at the arrest of Black mothers, but the complete erasure of Black interventions to teach Black mothers what freedom looks like. Like, so across this rich mediascape reading, she brings us through one of my favorite, like, because her work as an organizer comes through, drawing on her own political organizing with Black Mama's bailout campaigns like these that promise to bring real liberation, but are never as profitable as white rescue. So anti-trafficking, and I get pulled much more into mainstream anti-trafficking things than Lyndsey, and that'll come soon. But it's made me feel like anti-trafficking is that archetypical cool kid in like a suburban United States high school, right? They like come in through the hallway and they suck up all the energy and the resources and the attention and leave an aftermath of bullying in their wake, and most of all, center themselves. And this might be the actual problem of so much of even our, what we call critical anti-trafficking scholarship, is that it still always centers anti-trafficking itself. And I would love to talk about how to move away from this. I think with like funding. There's this question of why does funding need to be anti-trafficking specific? For years that I worked in China, and the tip office there would say, hey, we have money, send us some organizations that are working with anti-trafficking. And I would tell all these rural organizations, and they would say, no, we don't do trafficking, we don't do trafficking. And yet still the RFPs and the fund are still centering trafficking. Our work is still centering anti-trafficking. And we see, even in like academic circles, the work at Nottingham of Kevin Bale succeeding in creating and canonizing a scholarly tradition of modern day slavery studies. So what Lyndsey's work does is decenter trafficking and anti-trafficking by enveloping us in the rich tradition of Black studies. So what a gift it is also to read this book and to be able to learn these other important scholarly traditions, that your beautiful arguments make it unfathomable that Black studies hasn't been foundational to the canon within critical anti-trafficking scholarship yet. Speaking to the shocking parallels yet important disconnect between anti-trafficking and, as a separate part, Black scholarly inquiry into the afterlives of slavery, Lyndsey writes, quote, notably, the harrowing news photography of Black migration through the Mediterranean Sea has captured the attention of both anti-trafficking activists and Black studies theorists of the afterlives of slavery framework. Although both groups invoke the resonances with slave ships and slave auctions of the past, they mobilize them to different political ends. Afterlives of Slavery in Black Studies is an analytic based on the ongoing struggle for Black liberation, while Anti-Trafficking's mobilization of transatlantic slavery's aesthetic is based on the desire for white transcendence of historical complicities. And so here we see the beautiful superstructure of how the book is able to do two things while detailing the anti-Blackness of anti-trafficking, also detailing the project of white indemnity to evade responsibility, reparations forever. Particularly gripping to me as a question I think we can all ask ourselves, then what is anti-trafficking? And one of the answers she suggests, it's a white memory project. And this comes up for me in my research constantly. The Cambodian organization, a separate Cambodian organization that makes pocket scarves for men to wear in suits, calls them the William Wilberforce pocket scarf as a gesture to white abolition. Finally, Lyndsey's work is so powerful. This book is so powerful because she teaches us to ask the right question. So as she already mentioned in her talk, it is not what is trafficking doing wrong, but what does it produce? Quote, in shifting focus from what representations get wrong to what they produce, this book offers an example of how critical scholars can move beyond representational critique and toward assessing the undergirding political projects of image economies. And this is an incredibly important critique because, as Lyndsey shows us, this work, anti-trafficking has absorbed, co-opted, eaten so many of the critiques that have been launched upon it in the past 2 decades. I see abolitionist anti-trafficking organizations now daring to say that they subscribe to decrim. It is shocking. And as an epilogue and a perfect example of this, she shows how incredibly powerful and liquid the anti-trafficking apparatus has been, as it's able to, despite being deeply, deeply embedded in its anti-Black commitments, celebrate hashtag Black Lives Matter in ways that make it able to like tap into the like savvy, like, I don't know, liberal celebration of what racial justice, but also that makes it extremely profitable for them because that hashtag garners them that many more followers. And I'm going to end my comments and my thanks with a topic that Lyndsey and I both wanted to talk about, which is the recent BBC Africa Eye expose on the work that IJM has been doing in Lake Volta that draws heavily on Sam O'Terry's and collaborators' investigations into the kidnapping of child fishermen working on Lake Volta. I think what was so interesting about Mad Fury texting with Lyndsey about this the past couple of days is obviously not the fury and indignation of, you know, that it's happening and that it's finally come to light, and why it had been silenced for so long, but even how anti-trafficking organizations themselves, the right ones, our friends, are reporting on this, still using the question of good intentions, misplaced intentions. What can we learn from this? What can go wrong? And I think the final thing that both of these books have brought us to is that we both end in a sincere call to defund anti-trafficking as a way to move us away from this idea that it can be repaired somehow. Thank you, Lyndsey. Thank you, everyone. Let's talk.
Great. So questions, comments for Lyndsey and Elena. It's really quite nice to see so many old and new faces at the meeting today.
I also, as your oh, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
As we questions together, I also welcome any comments about how this relates to your own work, or resonances that you see, or differences that you see.
Hi, can I ask a question? I don't know how to raise my hand on Teams.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. This is Gauri Vijaykumar, Elena, Lyndsey. Hi. It was awesome to hear your presentations. I'm so excited about both of your books. And I've learned so much from your work already about so many things, but I think one of the things that I've really taken since like the first time I ever saw Elena present about this work, which was probably like years ago, is just how moral categories around what good gendered work is are produced. And that's really helped me a lot in thinking about my own work in India. So anyway, I just have like a more kind of question out of curiosity that I've always wondered about, and I wondered if you both had insight on it. I just found that, you know, a lot of times when I hear about anti-trafficking kind of in the general discourse, like people don't talk about how Christian it is. And at least in India, it is very Christian. And everyone I've met who's part of anti-trafficking organizations, you know, has like some connection to evangelical Christianity. And I just, you know, I love the vignette that Elena shared about Bible study and how it's, you know, not required, but technically required. And it seems like, you know, Christianity is always kind of part of these interventions or these apparatuses, but also disavowed in some ways. And I just wondered if you, either of you or both of you, could say more about how Christianity and the anti-trafficking apparatus became so intimately tied together, and what work Christianity is doing within these spaces, and how the workers within these spaces are sort of engaging with it in the practices of these organizations.
Thanks, Gauri. I put a link to your book in the chat. See Gauri's incredible book as well. I think Yvonne Zimmerman's Other Dreams of Freedom and Elizabeth Bernstein's work on the sexual politics of new abolition really did so well to illustrate how and why evangelical Christianity became such a foundational piece of early anti-trafficking efforts. I think so much of it was tied to Bush-era conservatism. It was tied to the fact that early on, the US White House had established like a faith council, that they still have, a faith-based council on human trafficking. For evangelical Christian organizations working in the sex trafficking space in particular, it stems from, Bernstein has suggested, stems from this long-standing desire to abolish prostitution at any cost, and really deftly capitalizing on the new renewed interest in trafficking as a way to funnel their long-standing moral panic. So even the Christian missionary organizations that I worked with in Thailand, they had been there for decades, operating formally as a different project that didn't use the word trafficking. But then as they are able to begin to tap into the the trafficking fervor after the year 2000, they begin to see so much more like profitability and interest. Aside from organizations that are doing social entrepreneurship projects, I mean, International Justice Mission that we mentioned with the BBC article and all their work around the globe, I write about them in my book because they have come to Thailand. They have, Glenn Beck has come with IJM and Operation Underground Railroad. Well, IJM has offices in Thailand, throughout Thailand. Bobby and others here know about the scandalizing things that they've done in the ground. At one point, their office in Chiang Mai was shut down for almost a year, I think, because of pushback, the unethical work that they do, that actually oftentimes, like, police authorities will say it steps on our toes. So only when it steps on the toes of the police does something happen, not when it steps on the toes of like the gross kinds of human rights violations that it offers. But what's interesting about all of these, Operation Underground is Mormon, while IJM is evangelical. All of these organizations seem to really be able to like mobilize their parishioner base to generate enormous like funding to be able to go to these places. But nearly all of them then, on the other hand, are these like paramilitary type partnering with law enforcement, bringing US military intelligence and supplies to countries all over the world. So they have their like security arm, and then they have their spiritual arm, and they meld together near perfectly. And one of the most curious parts to me is how pervasive evangelical Christianity in particular remains, yet how easily they slip into it's almost invisible that they're Christian anti-trafficking organizations. And people have said to me like, well, why does it really matter if they are or they are not? And my answer is, having worked on the side of how workers experience these, almost always workers are having to experience somehow and the religion, or like perform religiosity in order to gain something as a form of redemption. And these are the things that are, of course, not seen when you're advertising to donors, or in the case of some of these organizations, they used to produce like one set of catalogs for their Christian audience, one set of catalogs for their secular audience. But these strategic obfuscations just consolidate their power ever more.
I would just add that when I originally started the project, the best scholarship that I found in that was critical of the project came all from the critical feminists and the critical, like, people who had worked with sex workers and sex worker organizing, and people who were writing really smart and critically about sex trafficking. So I was particularly interested in doing a study that didn't take the religious angle and didn't center sex trafficking. Of course, it's impossible to not talk about sex trafficking with anti-trafficking, so it became part of the project. But initially, I intentionally kind of didn't go into those origins to see if there were other stories that needed to be told about the discourse, which I think there are, which is part of, I trace how anti-trafficking's framework of using the all-encompassing term modern day slavery is happening at the exact same time that reparations for slavery and colonialism is happening just conversations about that is happening at the UN. And so one of the arguments I make, backed by evidence from the US State Department, is that it was very convenient for the US State Department to say, literally, Colin Powell said, we're not worrying about old slavery when there's new slavery we need to be concerned with, right? So it was this like slavery talk, this way to use slavery talk. But to get to your question about Christianity, I do think in looking at all the visual culture, there is a way in which Christian organizations are really obsessed with the kind of morality, which many of the scholars have charted beautifully, that these moral panics get a lot of traction within kind of black and white religious thinking, where there's good and evil, there's moral and immoral, and that there's a long tradition in Christianity, in white in white Christianity of holding up white abolitionists from the 19th century as this really important time that the church was on the right side. Of course, that in and of itself obscures the ways in which the church was a key, the white church was a key avenue through which slavery was legitimized and justified as the natural status of Black people. So that's all I have to say about religion, but thanks for bringing it up.
Great, thank you so much. Go ahead, Bobby.
Hi, so good to see you, Lyndsey, Elena, Prabha. Thank you. It's always so great to listen to you. Your work is so important. So can you say a bit more about defunding anti-trafficking? Like, what would it look like? I mean, you already sort of made the case for why. But of course, as someone who works with anti-trafficking NGOs who provide assistance to victims of trafficking, you know, it's I just want to understand a little bit better around that, but also like what would it look like, where would the money be invested, and so on. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Just one second. I think, sorry, just one second, Elena. I think Mona has a question as well, so we'll just collect that. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, excellent presentations. Thank you, Prabha, for organizing this. Okay, I should put the video on as well. Okay, hi everyone. Excellent presentations. I'm new to this group, so I am unfortunately not familiar with you guys, but really wanted to attend. And I know Prabha's worked for a long time, so I couldn't miss you. My question is simple. In your research, were you able to identify the strategies that sex worker organizations or sex worker activists were employing successfully to either dull the assault of the anti-trafficking guys, or at least rebut some of their arguments successfully? And the reason I ask this, my dear, is because in India, that's where I work, and I work with the All India Network of Sex Workers, which works across the country. It's complicated. It took the Supreme Court of India to make even the faintest noises around anti-trafficking. Across party lines, the pro-anti-trafficking narrative is very strong. And sex workers have now become tired. They're losing hope that their voices will be adequately heard. They're looking for new strategies. And that's the reason I ask if there are some great examples that you can share. Over.
Great, go ahead, thanks.
Thank you so much, Bobby and Mona. Mona, I'll start with yours because I have some, I don't want to lose these two thoughts. And then Bobby's answer, Lyndsey and I can like riff for a very long time on defunding and hear other thoughts, but I don't want to lose the two particular sex work examples. I think first off, and this is one that's more murky and less direct, and there is a politics of refusal by so many sex worker rights organizations to even engage with anti-trafficking now that I think slowly has garnered so much support. It has really, really strengthened like decriminalization efforts, alliances across decriminalization that try not really to touch anti-trafficking at all, but really just try to establish like the momentum of decriminalization as a fundamental human right, and use that as a pathway forward, and then to tie into decriminalization legislation efforts to slowly take apart all the different like harms that anti-trafficking laws, whether direct or auxiliary, had been made. So I think one hard part is when sex worker rights organizations don't want to head-on tackle anti-trafficking, who want to carve out their own movement space. How do we amplify that? And I think that like, I shared like Empower and APNSW's beautiful films. I think so few people have looked at those films. So many people had been sounding the alarm in Cambodia about Somali Mom before Newsweek actually published its expose. And so, similar to like so many people in Ghana had been sounding alarm before BBC publishes its expose. How do we create ways for these like modes of resistance when they don't draw in, like when they don't try to take on trafficking, but when they just try to take on what they want? How do we highlight that? But then the second thing is I work with an organization in New York of Asian massage workers who Polaris Project in the United States has a huge illicit massage business as human trafficking project. And since 2015, it's increased the policing of Asian massage workers as victims of sex trafficking. Last year in New York, we were successful at introducing a massage license decriminalization act. So we didn't also go with anti-trafficking, but we found interesting allies, particularly because in the US there had been this uprise against questioning like the rise in anti-Asian hate or violence throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So framing it then as like a racial justice issue, framing it as an economic justice issue, because so much of this policing really amounted to like the policing. It was the policing of trafficking. Certainly that's who was funding it. But to workers, it felt like the policing of racialized poverty, the policing of, their right to housing. And so building alliances with like the Anti-Displacement Alliance in Flushing, building alliances with those like other groups that are far away from trafficking, like the anti-displacement group is never working with the housing justice group are not working with anti-trafficking. And I think the more that you find these other movements, the more that's where their answers are. And I think Lyndsey's shown that, in a lot of her prison abolitionist work as well.
Which actually brings us to the question of defund, because I think that one of the ways that defund anti-trafficking started coming up for me, Elena, and our other friend Sam, thinking all of our work together, the figure of the Asian sex worker, the figure of the racialized child slave, and then the discourses of 19th century white abolitionists, there was a push within critical anti-trafficking, some parts of critical anti-trafficking, to try to make anti-trafficking better. So to try to be in collaboration with racial justice groups, or to try to be in collaboration with worker justice groups. And we've even seen that happen in some cases. But what I feel like what that misunderstands is that the entire enterprise of anti-trafficking was always created to undermine those social movements, right? So that means anti-trafficking is a solution for states against grassroots transnational mobilizations for structural justice, right? And so the idea that we would make it better or invite them in or become in alliance, to me, is completely counterproductive. What we need is to fend off anti-trafficking and keep building these other movements. And the reason that defund becomes important is because all activists and nonprofits are very savvy. The terms of grants and philanthropist goals constantly change, which is something that all activists and nonprofit workers are very familiar with. How do you change the narrative of what you're doing to make sure that it fits the funding priorities and get money so that you can still do some version of what you're doing? But nevertheless, that savviness still does have impact on the work, right? And so just because some groups have started to take anti-trafficking money or have started to find coalitions, I think what it means is that we need to stop having anti-trafficking as a framework through which to get those donations, right? And also, the reason that anti-trafficking is a framework through which to get donations is because it's supported by billionaire philanthropists who know that none of its initiatives will ever affect their bottom line. Like, this is all constructed to protect global capitalism. And so I think that between that and what Elena articulated around the constant co-optation of reform, the constant co-optation of our critiques into, and activist critiques into, rhetorical reforms that don't necessarily translate into reforms in actual workers' lives is what requires the framing of defund, which is very much indebted to the framing of defunding the police and prison abolition, who have said that, you know, prison-based reforms only strengthen the logics of carceral systems. Anti-trafficking, of course, is built on a carceral architecture. No amount of decriminalization within particular interventions will ever change that. Yeah, so I'll leave it there then. Elena, do you want to say where the money should go?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in the conclusion of my book, I did an accounting of like the 6 different organizations, just 6 random anti-trafficking organizations that I mentioned in the book, and their cumulative 2021 annual budgets exceed $200 million. And I juxtaposed that against what it felt like to like work on several mutual aid projects during COVID to like pull together scraps that, of course, you know, mutual aid, unconditional cash assistance is maybe beginning to be talked about more, but is fundamentally like it's a frowned upon thing in the like development landscape because of all these very, very, very paternalistic fears of what happens when you give people money and you don't know how to spend their money, and they're going to continue doing all these bad things that got them into poverty in the first place. All these things we know, and that like we've explored in different ways with UBI and the other, but like just it made me realize, and then also, you know, sitting alongside sex work organizations, even sitting alongside like ATR, when you're like really hustling for pennies to be able to do some of these things, that kind of scarcity that's driving movement work juxtaposed against the actual amount of money that's out there seems unacceptable to me. That it seems like there is limitless funding if you call something anti-trafficking. And so how do we like push that lever to begin to like change the framework so that can be routed in different ways? And I think one of the ways that it should be routed are in more like unconditional forms of assistance. All of us, like Prava, I mean, so many of our work in anti-trafficking is to push towards this idea of, rather than only getting resources because you're a victim of trafficking, how do we broaden the social protection net for everyone? And so that's like, so those are the clear places that it goes, rather than only saying like a victim of trafficking gets to stay in the shelter for 6 months that's funded by the US VOC's anti-trafficking program. Like, what if that $200,000 program is invested in that same city in how more affordable housing for people, unconditional, that doesn't say you can't have been arrested, you can't do drugs, you can't be a sex worker. So there's the unconditionality of where funds should be and what people need to able to like demonstrate or prove to be deserving of them. And then the second like concrete example is just always like worker organizing, worker power. Workers want to work in these places. How can you build their power so that they can respond on their own and we don't need these paternalistic interventions constantly? But those things are still not happening.
And also reparations for slavery and colonialism.
Great. Wonderful. Any final thoughts or questions for our authors? I think it's really extraordinary that you ended with the question of unconditional cash transfers. It's something that links very closely to the question of social reproduction. So I think it's really valuable to, you know, to kind of depart from some of the silos that nurture academic careers, but that, you know, we've tried quite hard to kind of break away from. And that's been exemplified by the conversation between the two of you today, to really see how, you know, these kind of interdisciplinary conversations are the space through which we can comprehend, the totality of the issues. There's one last comment. I'm going to let them speak. Yes, go ahead. Shih? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to make my, I can't appear on the video, right? But you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, so my questions are about defunding. So the organization involved in the rescue project are not monolithic. There are organizational structures, hierarchies. And I guess like any other big organization, the majority of people are just food soldiers. They are doing their work. And then the question is, who is benefiting from this? Can we not bring in by influencing the donors? After all, who are the people who are making this rescue project possible? Just like a for-profit company, if the shareholders are given a important role, then you can decide the direction of the company. In this rescue project, if the donors are given a say, not just to give money and then walk away and garner the fame and the reputation, not caring about the few £1 million for them being just peanuts. What about the donors really put their heart in this project and try to play a crucial role in bringing in the rogue elements in this rescue project, so that the food soldiers still can have a job doing the good work, and yet no one will take advantage of donors' donations, rather than recommending this radical defunding, killing the whole field who has been there for decades, whatever. So
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Shih, I would say that it is not radical or rogue elements that we're talking about. I would say that it is not radical or rogue elements that we're talking about that have gone wrong, that they are quite central to how most of these donor apparatuses work. And then the other thing that you said is, interestingly, it is so much of donors' mentality is emotional and pulling at their heartstrings. And it's not logical or listening to actually what people, what survivors themselves are saying. So I've been in donor meetings where you can have a whole group, a whole board of people offering more logistical solutions. But if you have one passionate donor, I remember this one woman who was like, my bleeding heart is to rescue all the sex slaves. It justified carrying. So donor boardrooms, I'm not sure can all be swayed in like a particular logical direction. I think they are driven by emotion. They're driven by the mediascape. But I also think it's not rogue elements. They are core to what all anti-trafficking interventions happen to do.
Just to say, I appreciate your enthusiasm and your noble conscience in this kind of difficult research and work. Good luck. Best of luck.
Thank you.
The three of you and Professor. I met Professor of King perhaps several times while she was still based in the SOAS. So anyway, that's my question. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, Lyndsey, did you want to add to Elena's response? Or?
The only thing I would add is that one of the things I heard in the question was about the value of the jobs, of NGO jobs for workers on the ground. And I think that this is an important dimension of international aid economy. So this idea that, Sam talks about it, the BBC documentary mentions it, like this idea that a lot of the local partners of these larger philanthropies and US and European-based NGOs are carrying out this work because those NGO jobs are good middle-class jobs in places where it's hard to find jobs like that. And I think that the critique then is not to say, oh, well, those people are going to lose their jobs if we defund, but to rather imagine what redistributive economies would look like beyond and outside of a kind of neo-colonial global aid structuring of the way money travels from global north to global south.
Thank you. Very fundamental, different approach. Thank you so much, both of the authors and organizers.
Yeah, I just want to share that one of the bright spots in this kind of donor space is the work of the ILO, funded by the FCDO in the UK, on a 10-year project called Work and Freedom, which was really incorporated a structural approach to dealing with quote-unquote trafficking in the domestic work and garment work sector. So lots of very interesting reports that came out of that project, which really tried to shift the orientation of the donor space. So I think on that note, I thank you both for your incredible books. Please, everyone, do buy them and read them. They're really, really quite pathbreaking. And thank you for your time, and thank you all for being here. And we will share the recordings with anyone if you want to share it further on. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Oh man.